Hi, my name's Alexis Bollman, and today I'm going to do my presentation. I wanted to do it a little different. I personally am not the biggest PowerPoint fan or Prezi just because I feel like sometimes it gets boring, and I really wanted something to stand out for this presentation. So what I made for this visual part of this presentation is I made a pin board for my topic, and I'm going to show it to you if you can see it. So my topic is gender stereotyping in advertisements, and the keys represent the different key findings that I found throughout the various articles and research, and just really even videos that I watched about this topic. I included on the board my actual findings, as well as visual examples as well. Like one of the articles I read was called Care Bears versus Transformers. And it's called Gender Stereotypes in Advertisement. So I even gave you a picture of a transformer as well as a Care Bear. So when it comes down to my specific project, my project focused on how many companies use advertisement on social media, television commercials, as well as other outlets to stereotype the idea image of gender. I used various documents to portray how this has been an issue for numerous years. This isn't something that just developed, today, but it's something that we've seen for generations. And still is an issue that impacts everyone in society, whether that's your students, if you teach elementary school, middle school, or high school, as well as us as adults. So that's kind of where my passion came about this specific topic. When it comes to the focus of my project and the significance, my study predominantly focused on the stereotypes of women. I also looked at men. Originally when I was starting, I said I only want to focus on women. However, most articles talked more about both genders, and even I got to a point where it talked about transgenders with gender identity. So I'm going to discuss during this presentation with you how advertisements play a role in today's youth lives, as well as how it impacts all walks of lives. And kind of what this ideal gender is. I believe this is significant because I teach 7th grade, and in my curriculum, when I get to the end of the year, we talk about current events, and I felt like this is something that easily could be incorporated into current events as well as throughout my year, especially when I talk about World War II, and we talk about propaganda, Rosie the Riveter. Why was that, why is that still powerful even today? So on a daily basis, I have to build up confidence in my female students more so than my boys. However, I deal with more bullying with my boys on what's considered boy-like. And since I spend a lot of time dealing with this, I find that there's a lot of internal conflict of self-worth, and this internal conflict comes from the impacts that companies using advertisement when they make these types of ads, they promote this ideal image of what a specific gender is. So if you look on my board even, I try to use colors of pink and blue, because typically when we think of pink, we think of girls, and blue, we think of boys. And then I use yellow also in the back, even with my key ideas, but even some of my, framing of my findings, yellow as neutral. So I found that to be interesting as well, as how colors play a role with gender stereotypes in advertisement and even just in life in general. So what I have found is that I spend so much time trying to rebuild my students' confidence, and that takes away from instructional time. And I thought it's really important that I focus on a presentation that I could actually apply in my classroom and relatable to my students. Being in this course and previous courses, I want to make sure that whatever I'm spending my time on, I can bring it back into the classroom and use it year after year, not just for an assignment. So I've also had to deal with, and I don't know if you all have, but I've had to deal with students that have, even this year specifically, created and caused harm to themselves because of these images that these companies portray on advertisements. So I believe that addressing these issues will contribute not only to my knowledge and understanding of multicultural education, but it will help serve my students better. I will become more specialized in this topic, and I can find additional strategies to help equip my students with these current event issues. And this research also allowed me the opportunity to have an open discussion with my students about this issue. As I was making this board, my students saw me making it, and they were asking, they're like, oh my gosh, and we could have that open conversation like real human beings and not I'm the teacher, you're the students. It was more of a facilitator, open discussion type of conversation. I believe letting my students be inquirers and come up with solutions to solve this issue that face them and their peers every day will also empower them to want to make a change for their future children and change society as a whole. So the first thing that I really wanted to hit on of one of my key findings was from the Teaching Tolerance website. I don't know if y'all have ever used it. It is specifically this key. It's for a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so there's various lesson plans on their website. And what I found is the lessons from Teaching Tolerance, they were the most beneficial resource I actually found because it was actually lessons already made that I could incorporate into my classroom, and it didn't take up more time. So some of the activities include additional tasks and how advertisements break down stereotypes. And there's also additional tasks that have students think like inquirers to determine how they can stand up against gender stereotypes in advertisements. One of the lessons that I found really interesting is it dealt with reading ads with the social justice lens, which also relates back to the text in one of the earlier modules that Dr. Hamilton talked about. I also found that the lessons, they talked about how students could brainstorm examples of commercials. Instead of us just giving them all the examples, we could give them the opportunity to come up with ones and show them to the class. I feel like that's very empowering as well. One thing I really wanted to point out and show you all, and I couldn't have done this really, I feel like, in a PowerPoint, was the Teaching Tolerance has a really good graphic organizer about how advertisement breaks down stereotypes. So it asks them questions like, we are hoping to counter the stereotype, we are planning to advertise this product, and here's some materials we'll need. So I've seen people do it two ways, where they have students watch, one that I'll get to in a little bit on another website was the hashtag like a girl always. And so students were able to use a graphic organizer and talk about how that broke that stereotype of being like a girl. But I've also seen it on the flip side where they've shown a very stereotyped commercial, and then the students have the opportunity to kind of be the producers and go back and how would they change it to quote unquote break that stereotype. So I felt like this was a really good resource, and I feel like for those of you that teach propaganda and social studies and language arts, you could use this as well to alter to your lessons that you may be teaching for your age. So I found this website the most significant because I really think that it's important that we teach our students higher level thinking, and I enjoyed the graphic organizer because I felt like it was really easy to flow. So if you teach elementary school, middle school, high school, it's really adaptable to all ages. And I really found that there were so many different lessons from Teaching Tolerance where I didn't feel limited of just, oh, here's one. It gave you multiple, and you could choose what really best fits your student population. Because for my personal education setting, my 2A, which I have next, is completely different than my 1B that I have tomorrow. So I found that really refreshing that it was similar content, but it met different demographics. So I think that's very important. And I felt like most of the lessons, the purpose of it was, to interrupt gender bullying. How can we stop this? And so I thought that was very important. Another resource I found was, and I originally wasn't planning on stumbling across this, it was a transgender resource from Gender Spectrum, and it was called How Transgender People Experience the Media, Significance, and how is that important? And like I said, I originally hadn't really thought about it. So the research I found about the transgender individuals, what I found really interesting was that the participants in this study, 78% of the participants felt that the media portrayed transgender individuals as either inaccurate, and 95% of those individuals in this particular study felt that the media does not care what transgender people think of the advertisement. Also, the research found that 70% of the individuals surveyed felt that the representation of transgender people in the media are negative or very negative. I found this research important because most of the participants of the survey feared how others would view transgenders due to the stereotypes advertisements create. The research also stated that 21.5% of the participants have experienced verbal abuse that they believed was associated with representation of transgender people in the media on at least one occasion. Also, the research found that 86 participants felt that the media represented the trans people had, pre-anticipated these negative reactions among their families or friends, which was really sad to me. I've purposely put this on one of my key findings, and I'll zoom in a second. I found this significant as our students, they come from very diverse backgrounds. I have students who they may not identify in the LGBTQ community, but their parents might, or their godparents might. And also, I have students that they form their opinion on someone or something based on what they see on TV. So I found this to be really interesting. The research also found that, and I quoted this in my findings, and I want to make sure that I say this specifically and not out of context, but transgender people do not appear often enough in day-to-day roles, where their being transgender is incidental. Someone quoted said, "We are portrayed in the same stereotype way as those of minority races in the 1950s. So I found that very interesting. And this was, again, from 2010, this specific study. But I would be really interesting to show this to my students and compare it to, an advertisement from the 1950s. And why do we do this? Why do we treat people this way when they're in the quote-unquote, minority? And again, this made me think about, white privilege and being heterosexual and, being straight. How again, is that, of an advantage? You get treated differently than someone that isn't. So overall, I found this research helped show students how it's important to stand up for transgender individuals that are also discriminated against in the media. And I think this goes back to, earlier modules where we watched, city council meeting and, the member stood up and he said, we've lost this many, teens from suicide that because they were transgender or a member of the LGBT community and they just didn't feel welcome. So I think that's very important to use those resources we've had. Again, the key finding from this one specifically is this one. And if you notice, I showed two different brains, so like the male brain versus the female brain. The stigma of, women always thinking about shopping and bad hair days, whereas men think about, sex and computer fascination. And I really liked this potato. It said, so easy, a husband can do it. So I found that interesting. Now, obviously, those pictures I would not show to my students. I would make a new brain, but I felt like for your audience, again, I wanted to adapt it and use the actual findings that I found. But again, I would adjust that for my student population. Another key finding was I found an article on gender stereotypes in mass media, and it was an analysis on TV commercials. So the case study discussed mass media, how it plays a significant role in a modern world by broadcasting information in a fast-paced environment and to a vast audience, so a diverse audience. The author of the case study, her name is Miss Walska, she discussed how people organize their knowledge about the world around them by sorting and simplifying, this received information. The author discussed how gender roles have changed over the years, especially from the women's liberation movement, and that although there is still a pay gap in the difference between the genders, it's not so vast anymore, which is, similar to the readings and the modules that we've had so far. And specifically in Module 4, we talked about the pay gap, so I felt like that's still a current event issue I could talk to my students about. The author also discussed how commercials are a vast source of gender stereotyping because they often, and I found this interesting, they're specific to gender targets. So the case study found that women are most often presented in commercials and in categorizing them for everyday purchases, so cleaning supplies, whereas men, on the other hand, are seen in car commercials, cigarettes, business products, or investment commercials. So I found that really interesting. And according to Steve Craig's research in 1997, he found that women, most of their commercials is about preserving their beauty. I mean, turn on the TV. How many times do we see, buy this product, you won't have wrinkles, or if you want the best type of hair, you need this type of shampoo. So when it comes to specifically the idea beautiful woman, studies show that women must be thin to be beautiful and healthy, whereas men's stereotypes are they have to be a real man, so athletic, successful, professional, a seducer, and they must drive, a brand car, BMW, Mercedes, and have a nice smartphone. And I felt like this one really hit home with my students because in middle school, like, image is everything. Inside doesn't really matter, but it's everything that's outside that they seem to care a lot about. How many times do you guys hear your students say, oh, well, look at those, KDs or those shoes? And I never really realized it until teaching middle school of how much those little things build up again to those stereotypes. Oh, you don't play basketball, so are you even really like a boy? Those types of comments I found really interesting. The less popular depiction of men in advertisements are men being devoted to their families. And so this article kind of talked about how men are rarely seen in cleaning commercials unless it's something like, satirical, in terms of like the Mr. Muscle commercials where they are experts. And again, they're the ones in control, the alpha male, and they're advising women how to do laundry properly. So I found that was interesting of the gender role of, who really is in control of the relationship. So the case studies also found that advertising specialists use stereotypes of male friendships that show buddy narratives. So this idea of going to sport events or to the pub. And there's an increase on children commercials of the proper place in society for men and women, like girls, nursing dolls or cleaning the house, whereas boys do sports and play video games. So I would show those, Nerf commercials. You don't see a lot of girls running around playing Nerfs. Or the Barbie commercials, it's still to this day only little girls sitting around playing with, Barbie and Ken and Skipper. So, we install that in our children at a young age, even, very young, and yet we still see it through all generations. So in regards to relationship commercials, they only show marriages typically as a man and a woman, which shows a lack of tolerance and open-mindedness to the LGBTQ community, which I think goes back to that gender identity in relationships. The one advertisement that breaks down the stereotype is the Dove campaign that is aimed at women at every age in different shapes of figures. So I don't know if you guys have seen that commercial, but the women are in their bras and their underwear, and it's showing like all sizes are beautiful. And I would relate that to my students that, enjoy shopping, specifically, at least for my girls. There's a store at the mall here locally called Aerie, and they don't airbrush any of their girls. They use girls of all size. So relate that to them as well. I found it interesting since I'm an IB school, so I have to show things from different global lenses. There's a British commercial by a product called Ajax, and it presents a handsome man cleaning his kitchen with the product. So that's kind of a flipped reverse role of typically how we would, stereotype a man. So overall, what I found from the study is that show that commercials are powerful tools that create and shape people's opinions. And the author of this study specifically said that if we become aware of the stereotypes and teach critical viewing skills to our children, perhaps we will create informed viewers instead of manipulated consumers. And I found that very powerful and very important, and going back to my purpose of why I even wanted to do this to begin with. My next key finding is by Mel Exon and Melanie Arrow, and it was called 8 Ads That Shatter Tired Gender Stereotypes. So this one specifically that I picked on out of the 8 was the Like a Girl, which is what does it mean to do something that's like a girl? And, the commercial goes on and on about girls breaking stereotypes. Like this one says, unstoppable, hashtag like a girl always. And, it has a little girl kicking out the word can't be brave. So, and it talks about always their mission statement and how they want to help keep girls stay confident at puberty and beyond, and ask all girls to smash the limitations that hold them back, encouraging them to be unstoppable, hashtag like a girl. So I felt like, it really showed all these negative stereotypes and perpetrations of stereotypes for women, and how women are less than men. And I felt like the video my students could personally relate to, as well as be inspirational. And the article discussed how advertisement needs to adjust its message concerning gender roles to reflect a non-stereotypical portrayal. Um, the author of this article also talked about that advertising and the media can be useful in teaching youth change and discourage stereotypes. So the media can be used powerful, and we can be the change. We can still use advertisement as a way to sell product, but we can really use it to shape our youth's views on gender roles in society as a whole. Some of the most twists and turns that I found from this research came from other nations and not from many reliable sources. I felt like this was due to the denial of our country in that when it comes to gender stereotypes. In this article, she really talked about, and there was research of other countries are more open to breaking these stereotypes, whereas, we have some companies, like always, that will, break this image, but then they'll go back to the old patterns. And I think it just stems back to what sells, So I found that very interesting. And I felt like this kind of limited some of my research because there hasn't been much progressive change. So this specific one that I'm talking about is up here. And again, I'm just showing you. I used the color pink because I showed the picture of the girl. So, we always think of the color pink of being like a girl. No, a girl can wear, whatever she wants. Doesn't mean that she has to be wearing pink to be like a girl. Another key finding that I found was, like I discussed earlier, the Care Bears versus Transformers. And so this article talked about how the author had one time went to a restaurant and her daughter got a Care Bear, and she was really upset. She just wanted a Transformer. And so it kind of sparked her interest about gender stereotyping and discussed the increase of aggression in children advertisement and the constant gender roles seen in toy commercials. And, really what I want to focus on that is still today, even if you go through a Chick-fil-A, McDonald's, and you have, a child and you get a kid's meal, they'll ask you, oh, do you have a boy or do you have a girl? So I found that interesting that was something when I was a kid they always asked, and yet they still ask it, and we're not making a gender neutral or give them both the same toy, or ask them, would your child rather have, a little Furby, or would they rather have a little, little game? I don't know. But my point is we're still making toys even gender specific, I feel like. And in a lot of, at least my kids in my demographics, they eat fast food probably 4 out of 7 days a week. So it's really relevant. In the textbook, I included slides from Dr. Hamilton just because I felt like they were really important. And this came from Module 4, Chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9 on gender, but I just want to quote one thing about gender equality that, Dr. Hamilton talked about, is that equality is usually defined as fair and equal treatment among groups. So I found this interesting because how are they promoting gender equality when we spent 20 minutes talking about, from various different articles, this hasn't changed. The pay gap has gotten better, but yet our image, that what people see on the TV, hasn't changed. So I really liked the question that she had posed for us. Consider how you interact with your students and how instructors interact with you. Your interactions with students can reinforce positive and negative aspects and experiences in your classroom. And I really enjoyed reading, my classmates' comments. And it made me also reflect, when I call on students, am I only calling on the girls or am I calling on the boys? So I think that's very important. So my overall closing statement is, overall I learned that over the years, gender stereotypes have not changed, and although there has been some companies that have tried to stand up and make a change, they've fallen short. And so I found this very empowering, and I really want to make sure we make a change to this. Last thing I want to point out on my key findings is Professor Rice pointed out this TED Talks by Cameron Russell, Looks Aren't Everything, Believe Me, I'm a Model. She admits she won a genetic lottery. She's tall, pretty, and an underwear model, but don't judge her by her looks. In her Fearless Talk, she talks about why I look at the industry and are highly seductive, how they use that to their advantage for advertisement. So I personally would show that to my students of, here's a supermodel, and talk about that. I encourage you all. I can't wait to hear your feedback, and I hope you enjoyed.